Thank you for the nice introduction. Oh, I am mic'd up. And I wouldn't be here either if it weren't for you, Kent. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be in Calgary. I've been to, but I've never been to Calgary. So this is great, and you just rolled out the beautiful weather and a big party. Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. Yes, and thank you, Melanie, for making all the arrangements to have me here, and Mary Beth for inviting me. Yeah, I'm happy to come and talk a little bit about my research. So let me just jump right in. Okay, so like Kent, I was born in the north. So this is a map of Alaska. I've never gotten to use one of these cool pointers. There's Anchorage, and that's where the University of Alaska Anchorage is. And Anchorage is the biggest city in Alaska, about 300,000 people, under 300,000 people. But the main campus, the original campus of University of Alaska, is in Fairbanks. So sometimes Fairbanks claims that they are University of Alaska and that we are University of Alaska Anchorage, although we say we have more students. Right? We have 20,000 students, you have about 8, right? So, yeah. So there's, as you can tell by my inflection, some rivalry there. The weird thing about Alaska is that the capital is down here in Juneau, and so you can't drive there. You can only fly in, or you could drive like, you would have to come through Haines Junction and come down here to Haines, Alaska, and take a ferry to Juneau. Yeah, so it's unique in that you couldn't get in your car and go to the Capitol. If you want to talk to somebody in the legislature, you have to fly down. So I was raised here. It's called the interior of Alaska, a small town called Anderson. So during the Cold War, Alaska was very strategic. In fact, my uncle came to Alaska as a physician on the Dew Line. And so that was when they militarized the Arctic coast. And he was doing that and then ended up near Anderson, stationed at Clear Air Force Base. And so Anderson was the bedroom community for Clear Air Force Base. It was a ballistic missile early warning station. And so remember during the Cold War, they were very afraid of what the Russians were going to do. And so this would be one of the warning stations that would warn the lower 48 that the attack was coming. It was an Air Force base, and so but people were not stationed there permanently. They were 1-year remote duty, so they didn't generally bring their families with them. So all of the families that I grew up with mostly had parents who worked either as federal employees or they were unionized workers. So my dad was a Teamster, worked in the motor pool on the base. It was high times. Wages were good. They negotiated really good contracts, and plus he worked 60 hours a week. So he worked 6:30 to 6:30 for about 20 years and retired in his 50s because it was a good job. So I actually looked for a picture of the house that I grew up in, and like Kent, who also grew up in the north, we're on the Alaska, or Anderson, is on the road system, and that's a big difference, right? So it's on the Parks Highway, and there are only 2 really main highways in Alaska. There are not many roads. And so what people did, because they didn't think they were going to be there very long, is we call them trailers. I don't know what you would call them in Canada, mobile homes. Yeah, so they brought in a mobile home, and then they would build buildings onto them called wanigans. And so our trailer had 2 bedrooms in it, and then my parents built a Arctic entryway and a living room, and then a laundry room and a bedroom and a garage off the back, right? And then the next people, they busted out the other side of it and put on another living room and a bedroom in the back. So by now, the house is almost sort of surrounded by wanigans. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. The thing is, they're not very attractive. Even back then, they weren't attractive. So I spent some time last weekend at my parents' house going through the photo albums thinking, surely we must have taken a place of where we were living. And we did not, right? There are pictures of people standing out in front of it or along the side of it, like posing for some, event, a birthday party or something, but no perspective of the place that we lived for 6 or 7 years, because I think it's just not that attractive. And worse, those things, they're terrible, they break down. So the solution when they break down is to spray them over with polyurethane. and then paint the polyurethane, which makes it really, it's insulated much better, but it is ugly. Yeah, and something, I'll show you a house that's made of foam that's still, those of us who grew up in rural Alaska will look at polyurethane foam and think, oh God, like, that's a terrible way to live in that conditions. And then you spray the whole thing and then like you cut the windows back out. So, as Kent said, I'm mostly interested in race, class, and gender, and I wrote a dissertation about an environmental justice issue in Alaska. So also during the Cold War, they had this crazy plan in Northwest Alaska. They were going to build an instant harbor with nuclear bombs. So they had this plan. They wanted to test it. It was called Project Chariot. And thank God it never came off, right? But in the course of it, they did do some experiments with some nuclear materials that people in the nearby villages were afraid had affected them or impacted them in some way. And so there's a great book called Firecracker Boys about that whole period, which is actually chilling that they didn't get to do as much as they wanted to do. Okay, whoops, oh, I turned it off. Okay, so the obvious thing is, and sometimes we joke in sociology, is that sociology is the study of the painfully obvious, right? So in that vein, the obvious is adequate housing is the key to sustainable social and economic development, right? It lends to human dignity. It's often cited in international declarations of human rights. Like, you have to have housing, right? That people have to have housing. It's only decent, it's only right. We know that there are all kinds of bad outcomes, particularly for children, if they don't live in decent housing, right? Or if their housing is unstable or inadequate in some way. That's the obvious. And so when I wanted to study housing, when I was going to talk about, in addition to having grown up in a trailer, but then we moved to a house, and it was unique because we lived in a house and other people still lived in a trailer. Right? And so people would say, but you guys live in a house, right? It didn't have any trailer on it. And another thing is that my younger brother worked for a low-income housing provider in Portland, Oregon called PCRI, and it's a nonprofit, and they saw when Portland was gentrifying in the northeast section of the neighborhood, which had been the African American section of the city, they bought up the houses as a nonprofit and then rented them back out at below market rates. And so I was a graduate student in Arizona and was coming through Oregon to visit my family, and my brother picked me up at the airport and he said, hey, we just have to stop by at a client's house, like he was the maintenance person, and I gotta fix something for this lady. And so I was sitting there in her living room, and what really struck me is she was a young woman in her 20s, and she had a 5 or 6 year old boy who was hopping around the living room, and she had a job like as a secretary up at the Health Sciences Center, and she had a nice car, and she had a decent place to live. And I thought, you know, that's the thing that makes it possible, is that she can work a low-paying job, but she has decent housing, right? She has a decent, and my brother was there fixing some plumbing thing, and the kid was happy, and it really struck me as that's what people need, is a place to live. So when I wanted to study housing in the Arctic, the first thing that you come to is, what is adequacy? What do we mean by that anyway, right? What makes some housing adequate and some housing inadequate? So one of the common measures of adequacy is something called persons per room. So basically, you just count all of the rooms in the house, excluding the kitchens, the hallways, the bathrooms, and rooms used for other purposes, and divide by the number of people, okay? And so the standard now is more than one person per room is crowded. So for example, 2 people in a 1-bedroom apartment, because you would have the bedroom and the living room, would not be considered crowded. But if you added a 3rd person, that would be considered crowded. Now this is a gross measure, and actually the Canadian National Occupancy Standard takes into account like the genders of the kids, right? And the ages of the kids. So you could say like little kids of opposite genders could share a room and it wouldn't be crowded. And that would be under 5. And then kids up to a certain teenage age could share a room if they were the same gender. So it's a little more nuanced, But this persons per room is the most common measure used in both the US and Canada, okay? The thing is, the threshold is based on, well, not much, right? It's just a social construction, like we just decided. In the 1940s, we said it was 2 persons per room. And then in 1950, we said, no, the threshold is 1.5. And then in 1970, we said, no, it's 1, right? And then we go with it, right? For, no obvious reasons other than, you need a standard, right? You need a threshold. Now we say that more than 1.5 persons per room would be severely crowded. So if we, now then, what I'm interested in is, so at first I thought, it's just, you just find out what the threshold is and you just measure it and you start talking about it, right? And then you can advocate for people to get better housing and it's all fine and good. But what becomes readily apparent is, there is some ethnocentrism, right? Some cultural interpretation here. People in the North didn't live in buildings that had separate rooms, right? And this is why, I'll show you in a minute, rarely people will use like square feet per person or meters per person, but that doesn't make sense to us because we in the West have a really strong idea about privacy, right? And so we think 2 people in 200 square feet is one thing, but if you could have a wall in between them, if people could get away from each other, it's different. So we prefer, I think for that reason, persons per room rather than absolute square feet. Okay. So if you look at the Arctic region of Alaska, this is the total number of houses that are considered crowded. So the number of houses that have more than 1 person per room. So if we just start with the North Slope borough, we see that over 20% of the houses have more than 1 person per room. In the Northwest Arctic borough, almost 40% of houses have more than 1 person per room. In the Nome region, over 22%. In the Doyon or Yukon-Koyukuk region, we have 14.3. Okay, so what does that mean? That's compared to the overall crowding rate in Alaska is only 5.7, and in the US, only 3%. Okay, so much more crowding in Arctic Alaska. Okay, the same thing in Canada, in the Inuit regions, particularly in Nunavut and Nunavik, over 20% crowding. Okay, less here in the east and less in Nunatsiavut. Okay, but also note that crowding in Canada is less than in the US. Okay, so more crowding in the US, more crowding in the American Arctic than in Canada. This is Statistics Canada, as best I can. Here's the thing, is Canadians count kitchens, Americans don't, but Americans think that, it's sticky, that actually people overestimate the number of rooms that they have, which underestimates crowding, because they have these specific rules about separating walls, right? So they're not exactly the same, but they're similar enough. Okay, so Americans and Canadians brought housing to the North starting in the 1950s, and so I just want to talk about some of the problems with the housing. The first thing is, so here is just a floor plan of a typical 1950s ranch house, right? And so, what people did is they said, well, we want people to settle, and we want their kids to go to school, and so we're going to provide them housing. So they just bring up Southern housing, right? Not necessarily being ethnocentric, but just saying, like, we got to provide housing for people if we want someplace for them to live, and so they bring up housing. And actually, the picture before that was the first kind of houses they brought to the north in Canada. Okay, so these houses, for one thing, have all of these separating walls, right? Which is not necessarily culturally appropriate, but it does fit our idea of what a house should look like and how a house should be used. So here's one of the first kind of dangers, right? In talking about persons per room is that we have our own ideas about how many people should live in a house, how those rooms should be used, right? And that standards that even seem like as innocuous as persons per room can kind of be used against people to say, you're not living right. You don't live in your house in the correct way. You have too many people. Actually, Peter Dawson, who is an anthropologist here, did lots of interesting research about the way that people use housing, and he found out that in Inuit villages, there are people coming in and out of the house all the time, participating in different activities, and that they need more social space, right? They need less, like bedroom space, and more social space to accommodate the people coming in and out. Also, the Southern style houses, people need like moist, cool rooms for sewing hides. Well, those are not in like the standard Southern ranch house. Really importantly is that they need well-ventilated cooking spaces with big burners, right, for boiling big game for days at a time. So you know what happens in a not well-ventilated house is all of that condensation collects, gets into the walls, into the rafters. Pretty soon you have mold and rot, and then your kids have trouble with asthma, and the house falls apart, right, because of that. So it's not a problem with the user, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's actually a problem with the design of the house. The house isn't designed for the way they already live. Also, no space, like, they didn't bring up garages, but space for repairing equipment and getting your hunting gear ready to go, and also well-ventilated areas for carving, right? So all the dust would stay inside. Yeah. Right, is that their idea about who should be living in the house with whom. He also found that, people would, sleep in the living room together and then use the bedroom for other purposes. But people from the dominant culture would be like, no, that's not the way you use a house, right? The living room is for the daytime, right? And at night you move into the bedroom. And also, it's not, he makes a good point too, it's not that they just accepted the new houses and began to use them the way, and there's a Canadian handbook that was made for Inuit people about how to live in new houses and gave them instructions for that. It's actually really insulting and featured in a movie called White People Are Funny. But it's not like they just accepted that. They also re-inscribed it, right? Said how can we make this work for us? So they moved into the living room for sleeping. And he points out other ways, of course, the physical structure shaped society, the society. So for example, when you're all living in one open room, you keep an eye on each other, right? And so when you have separate rooms, people can slip away and engage in antisocial behavior like drug use or alcohol abuse out of the purview of elders. Also, if you live in a small space, you got to get along, right? When you have conflicts, you work them out. But if you can slip away to another part of the house, you don't have that same kind of interaction. So it changes the way that you deal with each other. And then a really interesting point he made is that in traditional housing, women had control of the kitchen space, the food, particularly seal oil, and that really was a point of status for women in the society. And not because anyone said, well, let's disempower women, right? But that when you moved into a house, and so Southern style houses have the open living concept. And so then people could pass through the kitchen without getting permission from the eldest female. And so it actually lowered, women's status in the household. But a really more, so this is just to say is okay, we brought housing up there. It didn't really work that well for the people who were going to use it. But part of the thing that happened too, because it didn't work that well, is that it broke down. And so this is a really interesting article, the picture is not related to it, about the provision of low income or affordable housing for Aboriginal people in Australia. And the authors, who are anthropologists, are pretty damning in that they say that the things that they provide are actually not houses, right? They look like houses on the outside, but they're not plumbed properly. They don't have proper electricity. They're not hooked up to the sewer system properly, and that actually they're just a fake house, yeah? And then though, what's really dangerous is, because they weren't a house to begin with, right? They break down, as of course they would, because they're not actually built for people to live in them. But then when they break down, then people, on the one hand, on a sort of racist way, can say, like, look, we provide housing for these people and they don't care about it and they abuse it and they wreck it, and I don't know why we keep giving and giving and giving to them. You know, sort of a racist argument about these people are inept, right? But the other thing, even on the liberal side of it, is that people can sort of wring their hands and say, oh, well, you know, they were hunter-gatherers for so long and they don't really know the value of a house. And that's the reason that they don't take care of their stuff, is that we just haven't acculturated them enough to know the value of it. When, you know, without saying, it's like the roofs are improperly installed, right? That it's so cheaply done that it would fall apart on anyone. So the breakdown of the house can be used against the people who live there, yeah, in a damaging way. And but if you actually, researchers have looked at, like, okay, what percentage of the damage in Aboriginal housing in Australia or among Inuit housing in the north is actually caused by the inhabitants, and it's very small, right? Houses break down because they're improper for the climate, right, or for the lifestyle of the people who live there. Another example is people who hunt large game and process it in the house. The cabinets that come from the south, and you know they didn't get high quality cabinets, are not built for that, right? So you do that for a couple years and they fall apart, right? But instead of saying, wow, we didn't actually provide the kinds of housing and the interiors that people who, for the lifestyle that they have, you say, like, look, they damage things. Like, how can we keep giving them things when they don't know how to take care of it? They don't know what it is to take care of a countertop. All right, so this is going on. All right, then another thing is going on. So I'm still trying to wrestle with, like, how am I going to talk about adequate housing, right? It's one of those things you think, oh, it's so easy when you start, and then you start thinking of all these things. Here's what else is going on in the culture is in American and US culture, the houses are getting bigger, right? Our ideas about what counts for adequate space is just ballooning. So in the 1950s in the US, houses averaged less than 1,000 square feet, right? Now they've doubled in size in both the US and Canada. Okay, so here's what it looks like. So in the United States and Canada, so in 1950, this is this average square footage of a new single family home was under 1,000 square feet in the US. 1945, slightly off on the years, 800 square feet in Canada. 1970, we've jumped up to 1,500 square feet. So you can probably think about your lifetime and like what counted as an adequate house. 75 in Canada, just over 1,000 square feet. By 2004 in the US, it's over 2,300 square feet, and in Canada, 1,800 square feet. Okay, so our ideas about space and what you need for adequate space in both countries has gone up, right, in terms of what we need. And also, I mean, probably interestingly, the number of bathrooms. And I remember reading some voluntary simplicity sort of book about 20 years ago and thinking, like, yeah, I grew up, you know, with 4 other people in my family, and we had 1 bathroom, and nobody was ever standing outside the, you know, door begging to get in. Like, we worked it out. And how, but now I really like to have more than 1 bathroom. Yeah, and so then it made sense to me, but now I'm like, oh, but I'm older and I really like to have 2 bathrooms in the house. Okay. Also the Alaska Housing Assessment uses square feet per person and the crowding thresholds. And this is actually the only big sort of study that I could find that uses square feet per person. And the reason is because we don't know what the threshold is, right? Like, how many square feet do you actually need? and how much is sustainable if everybody on the planet is going to live in adequate housing. Ugh. Yeah, that, especially if we see that we are living in houses that start at, over 2,000 square feet. Okay. So they have very, I think, tight crowding standards. So they say that if you live in a house that's bigger than 300 square feet per person, you're not crowded. So imagine if you live in a 650 square foot cabin, you're not crowded. You wouldn't be considered crowded under this measure. That's pretty small. Yeah. In Arctic Alaska, the mean is 353 square feet per person. So what I think they did is just look at the mean and say, we got a problem here. Like, we already know that we have a bunch of inadequate housing, and we got to put the threshold down low enough, right, that those won't count, because it's just an overwhelming number of houses. Meanwhile, the United States, the mean for the US as a whole is 916 square feet, so 3 times as big, right? So in the US, it's probably slightly smaller in Canada, like what we think of, or what has become the average is about 1,000 square feet per person. So I looked and looked and looked over the years for somebody to just say, like, okay, what's fair? If everybody needs shelter, what's fair in terms of sustainability? And I could only find, like, at one time I found somebody said it would be 800 square feet for every 2 people. That's small. And then 200 square feet for every person after that, right? So 2 parents and a kid, that's 1,000 square feet. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, right. Right, but this is the standard definition that's used across all time and place in both the US and Canada. So it's not a great measure. Yeah, well, and also, like, crowding varies by racial and ethnic group. So of course, poor people are more crowded. Yeah. So thinking about this, then I was trying to figure out, because actually I went to the International Association of Arctic Social Scientists in Iceland a few years ago, and I had a different paper about crowding. And people said to me, oh, you can't say that because Arctic people are used to living in small places and they like it. And you're arguing for something that they don't want. And then I felt like, oh, am I bringing my own white standards? And is this not a problem? Like, maybe, living in 350 square foot per person is something that works for them, and that I shouldn't actually be talking about that. And so I started to look around. What's interesting is there's much more outcry about inadequate housing in Canada, in Arctic Canada, than there is in Alaska, although the crowding is worse in Alaska. Yeah, much more organized. And so, for example, the title of this report, which came out in, I think, 2011, if not now when, addressing the ongoing Inuit housing crisis, right, and lots of data about the bad outcomes of crowded housing. And then this was a nice little study done with a group of teenagers in a village in Nunavut, also talking about the problem of crowding, right? So I felt like, okay, and then I kept checking in with people like, is crowding a problem for people or not a problem for people? And so I actually visited Nunavik in 2009, and people were talking a lot about crowding. And I remember one story about a young woman who had been to college in Montreal and then moved back with her husband to the capital city, Kuujjuaq, and they found a house and they had a baby and they were living in this house, but then the family who owned the house decided to come back, and then there was no place for them to live in the whole community. Like, everybody else was already so crowded up that, you know what, they quit their jobs and went back to Montreal. Yeah, because there was just no place no place to live. And I learned another term called hotbedding it, so people who live in such crowded houses that they actually share a bed with someone, and so when that person gets up, then they get in it, and so it's still warm, the hotbed thing. And people said, no, we don't want to live like that. And so, not to say then that it's not, that people aren't ambivalent about it, right? So I've seen quotes from people who say, like, we used to be resilient and resourceful people, and we started living like white people, and now we're kind of weak. We're kind of weenie, right? We used to know better how to take care of ourselves, and now we started, living like them, and we're not so good at it. So it's not to say that there's not ambivalence about housing and what housing does, but also, there is also evidence of that people recognize that technology is good, right? It makes your life easier. So Willie Hensley is one of the young Alaska Native politicians who in the 1970s was instrumental in getting the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed. And he was a kid living in Nome with his, I can't remember if there was adopted parents or grandparents, and they were out for the summer in fish camp. And he said, man, it was bone-numbingly difficult, the life there, just trying to get by. And that when he got back to Nome, one of the preachers said, do you want to go to boarding school in Tennessee? And he'd never been outside of the region, hadn't even been to Anchorage or Fairbanks. And he said, yeah, I'll go. And so he did. They took him off to boarding school. He learned to play football and eventually went to college. But it always struck me that he said, because okay, you can, it is our culture, it's our tradition, it's our way, and it is difficult, right? A difficult way to make a living. So not to say that people don't also appreciate technology, including houses, right, that have central heat. Okay, so then finally getting to the data that I've been working with. So this is from the Survey of Living Conditions in the Arctic, and this is just the Alaska portion of the data. So I wanted to see what I could find out about crowding just looking at, so the idea of the Survey of Living Conditions in the Arctic is that people all across the north would participate in it, and then we would have comparative data that we could use to help people in making decisions. Statistics Canada didn't participate, or Canada didn't participate fully in it. Partially they did it through Statistics Canada, which I think is a fantastic resource, by the way. But I couldn't directly compare the same kinds of questions between Canada and Alaska because it's not there. So the three regions that they collected data are the Nome region, the Northwest Arctic region, and the North Slope region. Okay, and there were about 635 cases. Okay, so what I found is that 58%, so this is different. The other one was what percentage of houses are crowded. This is what percentage of people live in crowded housing. Okay. So 58% of the people in the SLICA Alaska data set live in houses that are considered crowded using persons per room. Okay, but what I also found in the literature is that people say it's not the objective measure of crowding that's important, it's actually the subjective measure of crowding. What do people think about their space, okay? And that, of course, we all know that well-designed small space can feel better and less crowded than poorly designed large space, right? And so they're not the same sorts of thing. Only just over half of the people who live in these objectively crowded houses thought they had too little space. So they're clearly not the same thing, thinking about how much space, if you have adequate space and being crowded according to the measure, but they certainly overlap, right? They're not unrelated to each other. However, if you look at then what's most important to people in terms of how they think about their quality of life, it turns out that the objective measure is not very strongly related either to their satisfaction with housing or to the satisfaction of quality of life. The subjective measure is related to it. And so people who who say, my house does not have enough space, that actually explains the variation in how satisfied they are with their life in the community or how satisfied they are with their housing situation. Okay. So then I switch to, let me use that as my dependent variable, and maybe I'll use the objective measure as an independent variable to try to explain what is it that makes people satisfied, right, which is a part of housing adequacy with their housing. Okay, so I fished around for years in the data, trying to come out, always come up with the, some sort of telling outcome, right, that will solve all social problems and tell us exactly what they need to do. And it never, ever happens. And so you're just like, I just need to run one more thing, right, and just control for one more thing, and finally the truth will out, and the lights will go on, and it will all be clear about how we should set up public policy and programs to address this need. And it never, ever happens. Okay, so education is weakly related to satisfaction with housing in the way that you would think. People with more education are more likely to feel crowded, right, to think their house is inadequate. That has to do with probably, increasing expectations, right? I read that it had something to do with having little kids in the house. So what happens in the Arctic is people get crowded up intergenerationally, and so you raise your kids, and then there's no place for them to go, and then their kids get partners, and then they start having kids, and then there you are, right? 3 generations, and we have like romantic notions of it, but it's not clear to me. And I mean, I think that we might maybe overemphasize, like we're sort of nostalgic about back in the day, right, when families all lived together, but I think it may be more imagined than real, right, in some cases. So it doesn't have to do with how many kids you have under 5 in the house. It doesn't have to do with teenagers. So the great study that was done in Nunavut showed that people who have teenagers in the house feel particularly crowded. And I've seen this other places too, is there's something about teenagers, and his name is Tester, now I've forgotten the second author's name. They have a really interesting argument, is that teenagers make a house feel more crowded. And actually that makes sense in dominant culture too, right? Because they need a lot of space. And what they said is because school is a public space, so using in sociology dramaturgical analysis, that's public space that you need to prepare for your performance, okay? That teenagers need more private space, behind the scenes space, so they need their own bathroom and their own room more than other people in the household do. And so that's why you would find that people with teens in the house would say that, not just the teenagers. So the SLICA data it's kind of weird. It just asks whoever is the head of household to answer questions for everybody else in the house, okay? So it doesn't quite, it doesn't say what teenagers think about the houses, but I've also seen in other places that it would be teenagers in the home who would dictate who's sleeping where. Usually the teenagers would dictate they get their own room, right? And other kids would sleep, would have to share rooms, right? Or share with their parents even. So there is something about teenagers, but I couldn't make it. I could not get it to come up. Same thing with young adults. So I was trying to capture, like, okay, if it's not the little kids in the house, is it the 20 to 25-year-olds who are making people feel crowded? I couldn't find it. It's not gender, right? So I read things about, well, crowding may make men feel more aggressive and angry, where women may feel more depressed. Okay, I couldn't find it. It seemed that men or women are equally impacted by crowding. Village, if you look at in the Alaska case, so for each of those regions, there's a bigger town. We call it a hub. It's not connected to a road or anything, right? But it's the hub for the region where people go in and out of to get their services. That is less crowded than the outlying villages, and so I thought maybe people that might explain some of the difference in satisfaction with space. It doesn't either. Then so also people talked about, okay, it's not just the design of the house and the size of the house, it's also like if there is any dysfunction in the house gets too small, right? So if people are misbehaving in some way, the house is too small. I couldn't find that, you know, but maybe it's not measured in the right. I think they ask people about if you are using drugs or alcohol, or if anybody else in your household is, and what's your perception of it in the community. Maybe it just wasn't measured much in the right way. Right, here's what I found is actually related to the conception of having enough space. Persons per room is related to it, and then also repair and amenities lacking. Okay, so I'll talk about a little bit about what those mean. Okay, so these are the kinds of questions they ask them about the kind of repair that the house is in. So nearly 70% of the people interviewed said that there's a draft coming from doors or windows. Over 50% said there's frost on the windows. 37% had shifts from permafrost. 36% had draft from other places. 28.6% had leaks coming from the ceiling, right? Which is really bad in terms of keeping up repair. 23% mentioned stale air. 22% mold or mildew. 20% had dampness. 20% cold floors. 20% generally cold, and water is not safe. So if you just throw all of those into a correlation matrix, they're all statistically significant with too little space. Yeah, it all works. But if you then control for the effect that they have on each other, right? So these things are overlapping. The only ones that remain are drafts from doors or windows, frost on windows, and water leaking from the ceiling. Okay, so repair is important, but particular kinds of repair seem most important to people's perception of whether or not they have enough space. Okay. They also ask people about which amenities the houses were lacking. Okay, so there are actually two columns of that. So, of course, nearly 70% were lacking a generator and a connection to the internet and a carbon monoxide detector. 60% didn't have a place to sit outside. 30% didn't have a storeroom. 20% didn't have a place to cut meats and fish. 21% didn't have double glass windows in the Arctic, even double glass. I know some of you Canadians I know in Whitehorse, they have quadruple paned windows. Yeah, we don't even have those in Alaska anywhere. Yeah, it's sort of, 20% didn't have a separate kitchen, 21% didn't have a fire exit, 18% not having hot running water, 16% didn't have flushing toilet. I don't know why I have the word cold up there. 16% didn't have a bath or a shower, 16% not connected to the sewer. Yep, and so on. I think, except for the ones toward the bottom, most of these are statistically significantly related to perceptions about having too little space. And then, but if you control for the effects that these have on each other, the only ones that remain are carbon monoxide detector, having a storeroom, separate kitchen, and fire exit. So what's interesting about those, except for carbon monoxide detector, is they're talking about design, right? So it's not just space, it's the design, like is the house designed in a way that has a fire exit, right? It says something about it. And then of course it's obvious that if the design includes a separate kitchen and a storeroom, right? So it's not, almost 10 years ago now. Yeah. It was done with an interviewer. It was. So I don't know about how that was measured, and so if they would say, I don't know what that is, and they would show them, like it's a thing that you plug in, and it was expensive to do. Maybe, and then people were aware of the lack. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, yeah, maybe. So at the end of the day, so I'm back now to my original measure, my problematic measure of persons per room. At the end of the day, actually persons per room is important in terms of explaining if people, adequate housing in terms of if people think they have enough space. But it's equally important are the number of repairs, particularly certain types of repairs, and the sorts of amenities that are lacking. Okay, so it's not a terrible measure, right? But it's problematic for sure, right? It took me years to like think about all of the ways that it's problematic and then how can you work with it. But at the end of the day, like it does say something, right? It's just not all that. But it's so commonly and widely used, both in the US and Canada, like it's so readily available. Okay. So in conclusion, of course, there's a need for more housing, right, in order to protect communities and provide for sustainability. But of course, they have to be better designed, appropriate housing for the lifeways of the people who live there. Actually, there was a really good story, too, that Tester did. It was also in Nunavut. In the 1950s or so, they showed the Inuit people a plan for one of the ranch houses that were coming up, and they looked at it and they said, no way, like it's all wrong. Here's what you can't have windows on the north. We gotta have a sloping roof. The windows should only go here. Put the bathroom on the porch. We build it so that we can put snow blocks around the front door to protect it. And it's nice if you send the materials and we'll build it, right? And so they didn't say, no, 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 we're going to build the house we want, but that never did get built. But it was an interesting story of them, looking and saying, like, yeah, this is not, we wouldn't build a house like that. Anyway, these are some houses from the Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Fairbanks, Alaska. And so they are busy working with communities trying to build housing, because dang, housing is expensive in rural Alaska. So, and it's way outside of the incomes of the people who live there, who live, partially cash, partially subsistence. Like it's super hard to be a single home owner. And so they're trying to work with the cost. So this is the spray foam house. They call it soy foam, so it's not polyurethane, but I think it still looks like polyurethane to me. And the idea there was that they brought in all the materials on a cargo plane. This is an Anaktuvik Pass. And that then they put the house together, and then so you don't bring in all of the wood and the 2x4s and stuff. So they put the house together, and then you spray it over, and it's tight and it's ventilated. So the thing is, it has to be tight for the weather, but it has to be ventilated, mechanically ventilated, so it doesn't promote condensation. These are some houses in other areas, and then this is a really interesting house. Anaktuvik Pass is like drier, yeah. This is out in western Alaska in the Bethel region, and so it's super wet tundra, and so they build the houses up on stakes. And the floor plan is also like really well designed, so no hallways. Hallways are actually a waste of space, right? And so everything is built in this octagon shape, and what's the other reason for the octagon shape is because it's so windy out there. You don't want to have any corners that can rip the materials off the side of the house, and so that shape of house withstands the wind. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, because these are all still single-family households, and maybe, as you say, that's not what people want.
Value, but then you might have this other one, and you could ratchet the individual space down.
Yeah.
If you want a communal space for like celebrations.
Yeah, or it's like co-housing, right, where you have like big communal space and small private residences, right? But that might be a model. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Right, yeah, so the point is too, is getting people involved. So this house in Anaktuvuk Pass, they were gonna build a test house at a research station, and then they were gonna see, like get it all hooked up and see how it worked. And the people at Anaktuvuk Pass were like, no, you can test a house here. Like we need housing so bad, like we don't care if it works or not. Like just build it here and we'll get people to live in it. Yeah, and test it out. Yeah. And so that's all I have, if you all have any questions. Thank you.